decide what is best. So I'd like to introduce our speakers now, and then I'll turn it over to our first speaker who will begin the PowerPoint process. Our first speaker will be Kathy Butler. She's the communications manager at the City of Olympia, quite knowledgeable about the uses of the lodging tax and the statute. So we're very fortunate to have her today to help us out with this. We also have the Deputy Legislative Auditor at the Joint Legislative Audit and Review Committee, Jay Lark, and Peter Hynexius, who is a research analyst. And so they're going to cover the reporting requirements that are in the bill. And then finally, we have Cindy Evans. She's the Manager of Legal Affairs at the State Auditor's Office, and will speak about you know, what you can and can't do, and also would be able to help us with the questions and make sure that we're covering everything. So if there's nothing else, I think I'll turn it over to Kathy. We'll get started on this, and then we'll work through the questions at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Victoria. Good morning. I'm Kathy Butler, Communications Manager for the City of Olympia. So first, a disclaimer. I am not an attorney. I am an executive staff person at the City of Olympia, and I have been the executive staff for Olympia's Lodging Tax Advisory Committee since the council enacted what we called a new 2% many, many years ago, back in about 1998 or 99. So I've been involved with the formation of our Lodging Tax Advisory Committee and helping to guide them each year since then on our lodging tax process. So you will see that the changes are in the enabling legislation is in the same place of the law. It's in RCW 6728, the Public Stadium, Convention, Arts, and Tourism Facilities portion of the state law. Now, you need to keep in mind that the changes that occurred this year did not completely wipe out that entire section of law or the lodging tax portion of it. It did change two key areas, and we'll be talking about those a little bit in a moment. But you need to look at those in the context of the overall provisions of the law. Next slide. I wanted to give a big shout out to Victoria Lincoln and all the stakeholders that she worked with. She mentioned about how this change was pretty much dead up until the end. And yet, if you can see here the overwhelming support that it had, bipartisan statewide support for passing this bill. Once it moved pretty quickly, and wouldn't we love to have those kind of numbers on everything that comes forward. So there is broad support across the state, and a big shout out to Victoria, to our legislators who approved this, and all of you at the local level who called in and made your interest known to folks. So if we go on to the next slide, this is just a screenshot that shows the definition section of the law as it currently exists at this point in time. This is what will be going away at the end of June. And then on to the next slide, the tourism promotion area. So these are the two key areas where we have changes in the law, the definitions and the tourism promotion. So I'm going to begin by going through the tourism area. First of all, the definition of tourism remains the same as it was before. So tourism is economic activity resulting from tourists, people who come to your town, and you hope that they'll spend money while you're in your town. Of course, they're probably taking money from our town to your town, but then maybe you attract people from outside the state too. So it's that economic activity that results from people staying overnight in paid accommodations and purchasing meals and so on while they're there. The next definition is tourism promotion, and again, this, I believe, is the same as in the current law, and you'll notice down at the bottom where I've highlighted in the red that the bill adopted by the legislature does include the use of money for the marketing of or the operation of special events and festivals designed to attract tourists. So that was the key thing for many of us at the local level. The next definition has to do with tourism-related facilities. And this is pretty much the same. I've compressed this a bit. If you go out to the actual law, you'll see that there's a longer definition of what a 501c3 is and a 501c6. But a tourism facility is one that is, first of all, it needs to be a tangible personal property with a usable life of 3 years, as you can see, owned by a public entity or owned by a 501c3 nonprofit organization or owned by a 501c6 nonprofit organization. And then it also lists a number of types of business organizations. So if you don't have a computer with you, I'll mention those are business organizations, a destination marketing organization, Main Street organization, lodging association, or chamber of commerce. And the facility has to be used to support tourism, performing arts, or to accommodate tourist activity. On to the next definition. The definition of tourist has been removed, so you won't see that in the new law. So it was there previously, that's been removed. However, the reporting requirements speak to tourists and documentation that you have to make of tourists, and we'll address that a little bit later. Now, this shows the areas of RCW 6728, 18.16, the different sections that have been amended, particularly as it relates to tourism marketing. And again, you see in this particular section, it speaks again to the marketing and operations of special events and festivals designed to attract tourists. And I want to point out the design to attract tourists. This is something that we give a lot of thought to on the Olympia Lodging Tax Committee, and something that I remind our folks about all the time. We have some wonderful events in our community that are really just community-based events. This is intended, if you're going to use it for events, that they should be ones that are designed to attract tourists. So let me give you an example. Coming up in a couple of weeks, our local library is going to be blocking off a street, and they put on a wonderful festival at the start of the summer for kids to encourage them to read books. They don't do any external marketing. It's solely a local event. It's for people in our community and the children in our community. We would most likely not consider that they are eligible for funding through the lodging tax for that particular event because it is not designed to attract tourists. You may have the occasional guest who's in town for the day visiting a family or friend who comes, but that's not the purpose of the event. On the other hand, we have large community festivals such as our Capitol Lake Fair, which is similar to what several of you have throughout the state. That is a festival event that is advertised outside the area. It's marketed. We intend to draw people in for that event. That's the type of special event that we would be looking for, and that's what we think this speaks to. And then again, the money can be used to support the operations and capital expenditures of tourism-related facilities, which we've previously mentioned. I think if we can go back to the slide, there's one thing that I forgot. This also speaks then to the operations. For the operations piece, that facility has to be owned by a public entity or a public facilities district. And then that's for the operations and the capital. For a nonprofit organization, we can support the operations. So there is a distinction there between those two. Mm-hmm. In addition to the changes in the definitions and the purpose, there's been a significant change, I think, in the process, and in particular the decision-making and the information that will need to be in front of your Lodging Tax Advisory Committee. If you're a community of over 5,000, you're required to have a Lodging Tax Advisory Committee. So up front, anyone who applies is going to need to provide you with an estimate of the number of people traveling. So at the time of application, they're going to have to make that estimate. How many people are going to travel? How many tourists are going to come here for this event? They're also going to need to file a post-activity report with you. And there's been a report required in the past, but this one is going to be a little bit different, and folks here from JLARC are going to be sharing with you their thinking along that line in a little bit. There's also been a change in the recommendation and decision-making process, how the nature of the recommendation that the committee forwards, and then what your legislative body can consider in making a decision. So if we go on to the next slide. Again, I mentioned earlier that in the application process, the applicant must provide an estimate of how the monies received will result in the number of people traveling for business or pleasure on a trip. They need to estimate the number of people staying overnight in paid accommodations. Also, the number of people traveling to a place 50 miles or more and staying overnight, or people coming from another country or state outside their place of residence or business. So the quotes show sections of exact wording that are in the bill that was adopted. And that is information that the applicant must provide at the time that they are coming to you for money. Now, in Olympia's case, we're going to be redoing our actual application this year, and we'll attempt to provide some sort of an explanation. And this is the beginning draft of what I'm working with, along with the chair of our committee, who's a member of our city council. And we're going to be taking a new application packet and some draft language to our Lodging Tax Advisory Committee in July for them to refine. Because in addition to what the state law requires, our Lodging Tax Committee has traditionally wanted to know how did they arrive at that methodology. In other words, they don't just want a number that's not supported, but what methodology did you use? How did you arrive at that number? And then we will probably break it down, because our committee specifically likes to take a look at, are you estimating that people will be coming and stayed in paid accommodation that is specifically in Olympia, or will they be staying in accommodation that's outside Olympia, because we have sister cities here. So they like to get a sense of how much of this activity is going to generate business in Olympia, and then eventually lodging tax for us that we'll be able to have then the next year to invest in events and facilities. So we'll be coming up with some kind of additional wording that will be on Olympia's application. Now, if you go on to the next slide, you can see I've got 3 slides here. This is information from Pacific County that they had this year, and you can see that they were looking again. Their Lodging Tax Committee wanted to get a sense of the number of visitors. So in a way, what's being requested is not a change for some of us. This may be, it's now formalized in law, but it is what some cities have already been asking for. And if you go on to the next slide, you can see that the city of Wenatchee has been asking information about increased hotel occupancy, increases in overnight stays. This was in their packet this year. And then the third one that I have here is from the city of Ellensburg. Go on to the next one. Our committee is particularly interested in what Ellensburg has been doing, because they have been establishing a point system as a way of helping them with their decision making. Because now, with the change in the state law, the Lodging Tax Committee is going to have to make a recommendation to our city council and justify their recommendation, because there are some restrictions on what the council can and cannot do. So you can see here that the city of Ellensburg in the past has actually assigned some points for different things. And again, one of those is points attributable to lodging stays, and also then economic activity that results from tourists. So, as we mentioned earlier, going on to the next slide, we'll get in a little bit more to the report, which is really a report of tourist activity. I have here a report of economic impact, but the law really speaks to tourist activity, or the increases in the number of people who are traveling for the event, and folks will cover that later. So for the Lodging Tax Advisory Committee, this is for municipalities that are 5,000 or more. That's still required in state law, and there are still the same requirements in there on the complexion of the committee, how many minimum members you have on the committee, and the agencies that they represent. So you have to have the chair, who is an elected official, and 2 members from the lodging business, and 2 from those who could be involved in the activities. That all stays the same. If we go on to the next slide, you can see here, I think I show 3 different cities here. Some have different names. Now, like in Ocean Shores, they call theirs the Lodging Tax Advisory Committee. If you go on to Prosser, they call it the Hotel Motel Tax Advisory Committee. And in the city of Kirkland, it's the Tourism Development Committee. But these are all the same thing. And so the same requirements apply regardless of what you may call that group at your local level. So on to the next slide.
And they could have more than those 5, right?
It's our understanding that it would have to be in a proportionate number, but that's a question you'd have to ask an attorney. Okay, I noticed that Kirkland has 7 members on their committee, but they proportionately increased the number of hotel representatives and other agencies. So that would be a question for an attorney. But the law speaks to the minimum of 5. Okay. Now, for what the committee needs to do. So by law now, the committee can select recommendations from those people who apply. So I am interpreting this to mean that once you've set an application deadline and the committee is meeting, that they cannot at that point in time at their meeting when they're developing their recommendation say, oh gosh, I know that so-and-so out here is planning an event and I think we should fund them. Well, they didn't apply. So maybe you make them aware for next year, or maybe you do a new application process or a later application process, but for the purpose of that particular recommendation, you can only select from the applicants who have filed at that time. And the committee needs to prepare a list. So in our case, that'll be me on behalf of the committee putting together that list of the recommended applicants, so their names, also the project, at least I am assuming that includes what it is you're funding, because you're funding an activity, and then the amount that's being recommended. So the committee needs to put that together. Then it goes to your decision-making authority, and you will see that now by state law, your elected officials can only choose from the recipients and the recommended amounts that are on the list that come to them from the committee. Now they have flexibility, as I understand it, within there to say, okay, the committee recommends, that the John Smith organization get $10,000, but we really think that $5,000 is more appropriate because they also have on their list, another group at a lesser amount, and we want to increase the amount that they have. So your elected officials can change the amount. I am assuming that they can narrow down the activities, but it has to be from within the list that the Lodging Tax Committee sent to them. Now, when I was reviewing this and I sat down with our attorney, there was a question that was unanswered for us in the law, and it's how do you handle a proposal from a municipality? So in Olympia's case, we have a long-standing practice of treating ourselves the same way that we treat any other agency who applies. So if at the city level, if we are going to, if we're considering using lodging tax money for any purpose, we have traditionally applied through the same process as everyone else. However, in the past, it was with the understanding, the knowledge that the council at the end could kind of do whatever it wanted to do. Now there's this restriction where the municipality can only choose from the list forwarded by the committee. And the law speaks to the nonprofit organizations, doesn't necessarily speak to the municipality. I am expecting, although we haven't yet talked with our lodging tax committee or city council, I'm expecting that in Olympia, at least for this next year, we will follow the same process that we have in the past of treating ourselves just like we do everyone else, and then see what may evolve over time. So that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you.
Which is just a general overview.
Ready?
I am. Kathy, thank you very much. I'm John Woolley, joined by my colleague Peter Alexius. We are staff to the Joint Legislative Audit and Review Committee. Let me give you a little bit of context. The Joint Legislative Audit and Review Committee is a small committee of the legislature, and we conduct performance audits for the legislature. What that means is that they ask us questions and we find them answers in an independent, nonpartisan way. This one's a slightly different exercise for us. The question that they've asked us is, so what are municipalities using their lodging tax dollars for? And here, what they're really looking for is a report on a biennial basis. So our conversation with you today is to work through a methodology for that reporting. We'll actually ask for some volunteers, and Kathy has volunteered already to help us perfect this. We recognize at the beginning that what we need to do is get something out the door quickly because this starts on the 1st of July. We recognize that this is a ready, fire, aim exercise, that we're not going to get it right on the 1st of July, that we'll attempt to perfect this in the last 6 months of this calendar year, and then start the reporting process. So who must report? The statute's very clear. It's all cities and counties expending the lodging tax revenues. We can move to the next one. How to report, we'll talk about today, and we're actually going to show you an example of a spreadsheet that we've worked up to hopefully give you a little bit more clarity on that, because those pictures will tell 1,000 words. But what we're doing is we're collecting and recording information on the use of the funds under this revised statute from the 1st of July 2013. We have a little bit of experience in this, we actually conducted the sunset review of the lodging tax that Victoria talked about. And in that sunset review, we learned a few things, one of which is the difficulty of actually coming up with specific answers to questions such as what was the economic impact of the Dutch Oven Society? So when we're talking about economic impact here, we really are just talking about reporting on a number of statistics as much as anything else. So when we actually begin our reporting, we're going to ask that you have this reporting completed to us by March 1st of each calendar year. So the previous calendar year will be due to us on March 1st. That way we can meet our statutory reporting requirements. We are going to do our best to make this an electronic reporting for municipalities to JLARC. We recognize that the reporting process that you had in place with the Department of Commerce was not as efficient as it might have been. You'll see Peter will walk you through the Excel spreadsheet that we've got, which is definitely in its beta form. If we can work this out, we'd really prefer to do this in a web-based tool to make it even more simple. As I mentioned, version 1, the beta version, will be available on the 1st of July. And as I also mentioned, we'd like to work with a couple of you, big, large, east and west side of the mountains, to make certain that this reporting form works properly for you. Part of this is interpreting the statute and what exactly were the questions that the legislature wanted answered. And as we'll get into, there's some areas where they're subject to interpretation and there's some potential duplication between those reporting areas. Again, we'll try to work that through with you. The final version of the report we'll actually have in place by December so that we can then actually put this in place for the new calendar year 2014. So think of the next 6 months as a time to get this right and experiment, and we will actually have that conversation with the legislature that the first 6 months of data was a test run, as it were, that 2014 is when this will really become it's live on the 1st of July, but 2014 is where we'll really look at the data as a true representation of what's going on. I think with that, Peter will walk you through the Excel spreadsheet that we've constructed. This really just represents our thinking.
All right. And as John mentioned, my name is Peter Alexius. I'm also with JLARC. So if you have visuals, what you're seeing on the screen is the Excel mock-up that we've done. And again, this is very much in its beta form. We've tried to streamline this down as much as possible so that we just have sort of contact information for the municipality. So the person filling it out, and so we can get back to you if we have any questions. Some easy drop-down menus for finding your municipality among all of the different ones that are taking and using the tax. So we filter this by, you can select a county, sort of at random, and then that will filter down which municipalities are also receiving lodging tax in that county. So if you're one of those municipalities that straddles 2 different counties, say Bothell, you can pick either county and you'll show up in both. The important part is just to get your municipality name out correctly. Yeah.
So Peter, a little bit of context. Yeah. We got this information from DOR's reports on who's receiving this money. So it's one of the things that we'll use to make certain that our reporting is correct. If you got the money, we'll look at DOR's list to make certain that you've actually reported.
Yeah. All right. So once you've selected your name, we have sort of totals for various categories that we've identified based off of the revisions in ESHB 1253. We have there's three basic groups. There's tourism, marketing, events and festivals, and facilities. And then we've broken that down into municipality-sponsored ones and nonprofit-sponsored ones. And so you can break those out separately. So as you can see, we've got 20,000 for municipality tourism marketing and 15,000 for nonprofit tourism marketing. What we'd like, though, is more details for the events, festivals, and facilities expenditures. And so that's what we've indicated. Please provide more details below. So say if we had $5,000 going to a particular event or festival, and then hit return. This will tell you, you've entered in an amount here, but there's no detail down below, so you need to check your totals and make sure that everything's reconciled. And then also your total down here no longer matches, so that should be now 40,000. So the red will go away here, but you've still got an indication that something isn't reconciling. So that means you should go down here and, as John's example, maybe the Dutch Oven Society would be a good example. So if you hit return, that will populate the row of information for you. So we've got some drop downs. You can select whether or not it's a municipality or a nonprofit. We have it up here as municipality, so let's do that. You can select whether it's an event, festival, or a facility. So we've got an event festival. You have, from the application information, the requested amount, and then the projected number of visitors, or the estimated number of visitors for each of the categories, and that's again based on the new definitions provided in the bill. So these categories are basically broken out into overnight stays, travelers of more than 50 miles, or out-of-state travelers. Obviously, those numbers can overlap and they can double count. So we'll get to that in just a second, but basically different rows for each type. Another important column is then from the post-event reported information, which is how much actual lodging tax was expended on this particular municipality or nonprofit. And so say 5,000 in there. We've now reconciled and our little check goes away. So that's just to save some time so that we don't have to send these forms back and forth over and over. We also were asking for the total cost of the event. So say that was 10,000. And so that will give us some sense of how much the lodging taxes contributed to that activity. And then we want the total number of actual visitors that qualify under the statute. So say it was 10,000.
Popular.
It's a very popular event, the Dutch Oven Society. And then we would want the numbers that same number broken out by different categories. But as I mentioned before, these categories can overlap. You can easily imagine somebody traveling from out of state, which is more than 50 miles away, and they stayed overnight. So that one person might show up in all three categories. So these three cells won't necessarily add up to your total number. But we figure if we have both the total and it broken down, then we can get to whatever information we might want. So say there was 5,000 overnight stays, 7,000 were more than 50 miles, and 2,000 were out of state. And as was mentioned, we also were thinking that we would have a place to put down what methodology was used by either the municipality or the nonprofit to calculate these numbers. And we'll be working with municipalities and lodging industries to figure out what would be sort of a good menu for this. We've got just some again, it's a beta, options in here of a head count, a car count, a survey, or some other possible explanation. And so you can select for each of these, in case it was different, for each of the different counts. And then if it's other, we have a place to either explain the different methodologies that might be used or provide any comments that you might have on this particular line.
It's worth emphasizing again, Peter, to everyone that estimated methodology used and the ones that you see in that drop box is definitely a work in progress. We want to work with you to come up with some logical aggregations.
Mm-hmm. And I think that just about covers it.
Okay, now we'll move on to Cindy, and we see the questions coming in, so thank you very much. Mitch, you're going to move on to, there we go.
One more?
There we go.
Good morning. As mentioned earlier, my name is Cindy Evans, and I am the Manager of Legal Affairs for the State Auditor's Office. The amendments to RCW 6728 are going to have limited impact on audits of cities and counties. The amendments are effective July 1 and would impact audits conducted in 2014 for city county fiscal year 2013 audits. So it's always a year later. We regularly audit the expenditure of restricted funds, so which may or may not include lodging taxes in any given year with any given entity. It just depends when the auditor goes in and does the overall evaluation of risk for that entity. When we audit for hotel, motel, lodging tax revenues, these 4 bullets set out what we normally look for. We determine whether a LTAC, the Lodging Tax Advisory Committee, is required, and is the committee made up of those who should. Is the committee makeup appropriate? There was a question before earlier, can you have more than 5? And the answer to that question is yes. In 6728-817 sub 1, it says the committee must be at least 5 members. And if you have more than 5, it requires, as noted earlier, there has to be a proportional number between the lodging tax folks who spend and those who provide lodging. We would review the projects approved by the LTAC committee and the actual expenditures to determine if they're in compliance. We'd verify that lodging tax revenues the revenues are accounted for in a separate fund, and that expenditures occurring after July 1, 2013 were not used for tourism-related facilities owned by nonprofit organizations. Okay, so minimal impact. This is something we do often. Thank you.
Okay, so you've heard from our speakers, and in the meantime, staff here at AWC have been making note of questions, and there have been some good ones that have come in. So how do you want to handle the questions? Okay, go ahead.
Okay, and I apologize. We've had quite a few questions, and we've been scribbling notes seriously, but we'll get to as many as we can. And then, as Victoria mentioned, we will follow up. We'll figure out a way to follow up on the ones we're not able to answer. So the first question is, does the law require festivals to attract overnight visitors, or are day trippers okay?
Abby, you want to answer that?
Day trippers are okay. Ding, ding, ding.
That was easy.
But what you're doing in your reporting is reporting those areas that that stay overnight or come from far away or come from another country to get an idea of what kind of visitors you're actually having.
Yes.
Okay. And then another question is, can the municipality change the amounts recommended by the LTAC?
Yes, you can change the amounts, but it has to be from within the list of agencies that are recommended by the Lodging Tax Committee.
So we had one of the questions came in from somebody who said they disagree with that interpretation. So I think we should take a look at that, and when we send out information that is following up on some of these questions, we'll further clarify that. Do you have any comments on that, Cindy? No? No. Okay.
Does the municipality have to make all of the funds available, or can they hold funds back to be used at their discretion for other allowable uses?
Okay, so you want to listen to this question
Sorry,
again? And see if
say
there's-
again.
Okay, sorry about that.
Over here.
Does the municipality have to make all of the funds available, or can they hold funds back to be used at their discretion for allowable uses?
Okay, so, according to the statute, I'm trying to find it, statutory change. Let me look at my copy. Sorry. Apologies.
That's all right, that's all right.
So while she's looking that up, I'll go back to the prior one because Victoria just pointed out to her that when we were looking at it in Olympia, that we may have misinterpreted what it says, and so I'll read the exact wording, which says the municipality may choose only recipients from the list of candidates and recommended amounts provided by the local lodging tax advisory committee. So that may not provide the flexibility that we were hoping for, and again, it's the sort of thing that we will sort out.
Okay, that's a good answer. Thank you, Kathy. And so we do need to clarify that. I think that's an important point that people will ask more about. So, so thank you for the question. We appreciate that. And like I said, we'll make sure that we thoroughly review that and that you have the correct information. So then, Cindy?
Well, I think the city can choose all, some, or none of the activities, but they're limited. So I believe it's my understanding, I couldn't find it in the statute off the cuff, but that they can allow their lodging tax revenues to build over time if they have a large project that they would like to save up for.
So then it gets back to the question that Kathy was addressing, and that is, if you choose some, the question is, do you choose the ones that are listed there? Let's say the Dutch Oven Society, and they recommended $5,000 to it, and they recommended 3 others, and you choose 2. Do you take the Dutch Oven Society at the $5,000 as was recommended by LTAC and not fund the other 2? Or is there a question about the remaining money? So it seems to say you need to take the recommended amount, and again, we'll clarify that. So I think that's the answer to Cindy's question. Okay?
Can a city or county amend a contract written in January 2013 that was for marketing only to include operations after July 1st, 2013, if the grant funding is not changed, or would it have to go back through the LTAC?
So the question is, can they add something
Well,
to it?
I think the question is that if they've awarded this year, they awarded for operations only, or for marketing only, and now
they were unsure about how the law was going to.
And now they would like to amend that to be able to include operations. Can they do that now, or do they need to go back through the LTAC process to change that use, if it's the same amount?
We may need to look into that.
This is Cindy. This is an area that I don't know if we would look at this area. We're going to look at what the committee's approved. So this may more be an internal committee issue or internal to the entity versus what would the auditor look at.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's another one we'll make sure that we've got the right information on and get that information out. Other questions?
Are long-term commitments previously made into the future grandfathered in under this legislation?
So they funded somebody from long-term commitments. How can you do that when you're spending future money?
Well, there's still, and this is just thinking out loud here because, this is raising a lot of questions for us, and as was mentioned earlier, we'll be kind of feeling our way through this change, but there's still the other portions of this particular law that speak to when, in the case of the Lodging Tax Advisory Committee, what they look at. And one of those is that there has to be a change in use. So that's something that we may want to take a look at and get some information out. How does this work in relation to the other requirements of the law that still exist?
That's a good point. That's right.
I know for us in Olympia, we have a long-standing commitment of funding for a city-owned tourism facility, the Washington Center for the Performing Arts, and that's not been a change in use for us. So it's not considered by our Lodging Tax Advisory Committee because we're not changing that use.
Okay.
But that's just me speaking.
Mm-hmm.
Kathy, just for discussion purposes, thinking about Victoria's, when you have a commitment, presumably your contractual commitment recognizes subject to available funding.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Okay. Another question. We have quite a few of them. Sheila, do you have something there? Or Serena?
Hold on, I have one. So maybe it seems like we have a number of questions about requirements for cities under 5,000. And I think so one is a question about the LTAC process itself and if they'll be required to go through that.
So I think I can speak to that if the city's population is under 5,000, you are not required to have a lodging tax advisory committee. Now, some smaller communities, they may be tourism destinations, and they may have hotels or campgrounds or whatever where they bring in money. But you are not required to have an LTAC committee with a population of less than 5,000. Having said that, you can have one, so there's no reason why you couldn't if you wanted to in order to help work that through. But if you don't have it, Sheila, then it's the legislative body that makes the decisions, correct?
That's correct.
So they would have an application process and it would go to the legislative body and they would organize it in a manner that worked for them.
That's correct.
So that was one of the questions.
And related to that is if a city under 5,000 does choose to have a lodging tax, an LTAC, are they required then to conform to the requirements in the bill?
Sheila, what's your thinking on that?
I don't believe that's the case because in the new section with the new reporting requirements, it a change to RCW 6728-1816 and its subsection 4. Subsection 2, I guess now, B1, in a municipality with a population of 5,000 or more, applicants applying for use of revenues must submit their applications and estimates described under A. So I think it's intended to apply to cities over 5,000. And I would welcome the auditor's thoughts about that.
I think you're correct. As always, hopefully, if it's a entity with less than 5,000, that they have a policy or some sort of procedure that outlines what they're doing, so that when the auditor goes into the audit, we can see what they did and why. But I think it would be left up to the entity to determine what goes
policies and practices and procedures are.
And I think that's a good point, that you need to be able to, people need to be able to look at it and determine what it is that you as an entity are doing. And so it's always a good idea to be able to lay out what, how you're operating and what your intentions are as a legislative body. It's just generally a good idea to do that.
Another question was relating to the reporting and what's the requirements for cities under 5,000 to report to JLARC.
Well, lots of paper shuffling here. So hold on a second.
Really good questions.
The reporting requirements are under subsection C, and I think that all recipients must submit a report to the municipality, and all municipalities receiving a report must make it available to JLARC. So I don't think there's any population threshold for reporting to.
So therefore, on your reporting draft that you have up there where it pops down, it's going. I noticed you have South Cleellum, which I think is far under 5,000, if I'm not mistaken. You'll have them all there, and the expectation that everyone will put in a report about how they use the funds.
Yes.
Okay. There's the answer. Next question.
So this is a more technical question. On the form, do you want a requested or approved amount?
I think we showed that we have both. Well, I'm sorry, different question.
Or the LTAC, I think, yeah.
I'm assuming it's likely to be, we'll work with the cities, but it's likely to be the approved amount.
I would think so, because, what you're dealing with is what the pre-application amount was and what they actually did with it. Not so much how they got to the first step.
Yeah, no.
That's a lot more information that's, what are you going to do with it? I wonder. So.
And there also may be a difference between what was approved and what was actually expended.
And that will show on the form, because here's what they estimated and here's what they were authorized to use, and then here's what actually was used for, how many visitors came, and how much they actually spent.
Because you may approve a $5,000 contract, but they may only have $4,500 of eligible expenses. So there could be a difference between what was actually expended and what was approved.
And then the rest of that stays in your account, in the fund, right? Okay, another question.
Another question. Under the new revisions, do applications need to go directly to the LTAC rather than pass through the city? Typically, they've gone to the city council first, or they need to go to the LTAC now.
And I can imagine that each entity is going to lay out what their process is. Is that not right?
It actually states that in municipalities over 5,000 that
it goes to the
LTAC, so the city council would not be reviewing, making recommendations, or forwarding some applications, but not all. They all should be going to the LTAC.
Okay, so then the jurisdiction will want to clearly state what how they do that, how the applications come in, what the process is for you to get them to the LTAC committee, so that people are not confused about how to do that.
And again, that's in the population of 5,000 or more jurisdictions.
And so do you, and the City of Olympia, for example, do you have it on your website or on the forms or whatever, that this is the process for getting your information in?
Yes, we do, and I did a search of several other communities out there in the state, and it's actively out there for other people too, and you submit to the Lodging Tax Advisory Committee.
Okay.
So I'm going to ask a question that intrigues me. The city owns a building leased to the Chamber of Commerce, part office and part tourism center. LTAC fund supports the Tourism Visitor Center. Is this configuration exempt from reporting requirements under the new law? So it's a visitor center. Is that a tourism facility, or is that marketing that I think is exempt?
People are thinking.
So the facility is owned by the city?
Owned by the Chamber of, the city owns the building and it's leased to the Chamber of Commerce.
Well, it's owned by the public entity.
Well, if it's supporting the operations of a tourism-related facility, then that would apply to the reporting requirements.
Is the city over, the reporting, sorry, this is Cindy. No, I'm standing down.
Okay, so you want to state it again?
Okay, so there is still some question about the detailed reporting for municipality-owned facilities, but in general, that it would appear that supporting the operations of tourism-related facilities such as that building, you would need to report to us, at least at JLARC, the amounts for that.
Okay. And we'll make sure that we, again, that we clarify some of these and make the information available to everyone, because it seems like these are some of the questions that are coming up over and over again. Do we have time for one more question?
You have one, you can.
Well, we can, since we're here, we can address the one that likely a bunch of folks that have had to report in the past. Any guidance on how applicants are to come up with the estimates required by the legislation? It appears to be an exceedingly difficult task. We recognize the difficulty of this task in terms of, in the first instance, coming up with something one would call actual. So, thinking about the procession of the species in Olympia, how does the city of Olympia figure out the actual count? There are techniques that can do that. We don't want to dictate that. We basically are hoping to learn from you what the most logical approaches to that might be. We recognized in our research that one can spend $10,000 estimating actual attendance of a $5,000 festival. So we hope to work through with you municipalities exactly the sorts of techniques that you're using, and that will indeed be part of our response to the legislature, how the municipalities are estimating actual attendance. So we look at that in part as an education process of the legislature in terms of the reasonable expectations of attendance, while recognizing some places might actually sell tickets, so it's easy, ticket sales, or you might have a specific place where cars are parked, so you count cars. We'll be working through that with you over the years and reporting those techniques and methods to the legislature.
So we did have this conversation during the legislative session quite a bit about how jurisdictions actually get data information, pre-estimates and post-actuals and that sort of thing. And we talked it over with the destination marketing folks, and I know that they have told me they have a process in place where they get data and they can easily get this information. So I think what would be good for us is for me to talk with them again, and in our information that we'll get out to you, we'll help them, have them help us to answer that question about, what's a good method, or what are ways that you can gather the data and be fairly accurate about it. So having said all that, thank you for your questions. There are a lot of them, and we will work to get information back out to you. The webinar and the related materials, we did have questions about the PowerPoint. They'll be archived on the AWC website under online learning. So be sure to look there, and I think you can access the PowerPoint at that place and any other related material. MRSC has a really good blog, and they've put out information on the lodging tax recently, some very good information that may answer some of your questions. So be sure to look at MRSC under lodging tax. And finally, we're going to take some of these questions and, again, clarify some of this, get further information for you, and put something out early next week. So if you were a participant in this webinar, we'll make sure that you are notified where you can get that information, or we'll get it to you in some fashion.
Well, Victoria, one
Yeah.
thing before signing off, I'm going to put Kathy on the spot here. We've requested some volunteers to work with us, and Kathy has volunteered. I would greatly appreciate any other volunteers perhaps getting in touch with Kathy, and we can put a work crew together.
Sure.
That would be very helpful.
Or is there another way to do it? I mean, how do you feel about that? Yeah, why don't people contact AWC, and let us know, and we'll put this work group together to help JARC to finalize or get a form that's usable and relevant and helpful to them and helpful to us at the same time.
Perfect.
So we do need more than just one jurisdiction to help with that. So consider volunteering.
It'll be in your best interest.
So thank you, everyone, again, for participating, and we are going to close this webinar.